I think we will start. So welcome everyone to the ICOM Code of Ethics webinar. ICOM Canada agreed to do a webinar and consultation, and sorry if it was sort of a little bit last minute, but we we did get some pretty amazing people to come and talk to us. So a revised ICOM Code of Ethics, this is a discussion for museums in Canada. And we're very pleased to welcome Sally Yerkovich, who's the president of the ICOM Standing Committee on Ethics and a member of ICOM U-S. She's going to be introducing the ICOM Code of Ethics, and she'll also talk about her work and the consultation that's been done so far on the revised code. Michele Rivet is our vice president of ICOM Canada. She's also the vice chair of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and she's going to talk about the Code of Ethics in the context of the new museum definition. Sarah Carr-Locke is the secretary of ICOM Canada, and she's also the director of the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre in Yellowknife. And Sarah Carr-Locke will talk about the recent changes to the Canadian Archaeological Association's ethical statements from her perspective as a member of the Ethical Review Committee. And finally, last but not least, Viviane Gosselin is the Director of Collections and Exhibitions and the Curator of Contemporary Culture at the Museum of Vancouver. And Viviane will talk about how ICOM's Code of Ethics Rethink should focus on the social responsibility of museums in engaging communities in the climate emergency movement. And so welcome everyone. And Sally, if you would like to start, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elka. And thank you very much to ICOM Canada for organizing this webinar. It's the Ethics Committee really appreciates your help. We're trying to let as many people know as we can about the revision of the Code of Ethics. First slide, please. The Code of Ethics is a cornerstone for ICOM. It's one of its key documents, and we've revised a participatory process for the revision through 4 consultations. I'll be talking a little bit tonight about the first and second consultation, and then giving you a preview of what will happen in the future. Your participation is really crucial to the process. We want to try to include as many voices from different parts of the world and from different aspects of working in museums as we can, so that we can be sure to address the current limitations of the code and current concerns that people have about their work in museums. Next slide. The Code of Ethics sets minimum standards of professional practice and performance for museums and their staff. It encourages knowledge about museum work and also encourages the sharing of values. For our shared values really are the underpinning of the Code of Ethics. The code is a reference document for museum professionals globally. In some countries, it's actually become part of the law, but in all countries, we hope that it provides guidance for ethical practice in museums. When you join ICOM, you agree to abide by the code. So it's an important document for us all. Next slide. The Code of Ethics was first adopted in 1986 when ICOM met in Buenos Aires. It was then amended in 2001, and again, the amendment was revised in October of 2004. So what we're working on now is actually, depending on how you count, either the second or the third revision of the Code of Ethics. The revision that was passed in 2004 has now been translated into over 36 languages, and we hope that this code will do the same. Obviously, it will be initially translated into the 3 ICOM languages, but then we hope there'll be more. Next slide. The Ethics Committee was established at the beginning of, just after the Code of Ethics was first passed by ICOM. And the role of the committee is to monitor the application of the code, to recommend changes in the code, to advise the leadership and the membership of ICOM on ethical issues, to conduct concerted reflections on issues of particular importance, and to create tools to serve the museum community. In recent years, before we began the revision of the Code of Ethics, we developed 3 sets of guidelines, one on accessioning, another on de-accessioning, and the third on fundraising. The guidelines are intended to enhance the Code of Ethics and to provide more specific best practice or guidance on each of the issues. After the meetings in Kyoto, the Ethics Committee made a recommendation to the ICOM Executive Board that it was time to revise the Code of Ethics. It's become even more apparent in the 3 years since then that the current code, while very strong, is missing emphases on issues that are really important to us today. And so what we'd like to hear from you and from all ICOM members is what those issues are and what kinds of changes should be made to the code. Next slide. So far, we've conducted 2 consultations. The first consultation was in early 2001, and the second was in early 2002. After we discussed in Prague the preliminary results from the second consultation, essentially what we had heard from people, and we decided at that point that we wanted to extend the second consultation until the end of October of this year so that more people could participate. We found that there was a lot of interest in participating, especially after the museum definition had been resolved. So we have designed what we hope will be a revision process that is democratic and transparent, and that will allow people to come in at different stages of the process and participate and share their opinions with us. Next slide. The first consultation was relatively brief. It asked if your committee, in this case ICOM Canada, had undertaken any projects or created any publications related to the ICOM Code of Ethics for museums. We wanted to collect the publications that might help us understand where the weaknesses of the code were or where people felt the code needed to be elaborated upon. So we did find a number of documents. We also asked if people felt that the Code of Ethics should be updated. And if that was the case, we asked what people felt was missing or what needs to be added or what needs to be changed to the code. While we didn't have a huge participation in this first consultation, we did find an overwhelming number of people felt that the code needed to be revised, and that gave us a chance to really forge ahead with this process. Next slide. What we heard in that first consultation was a number of issues needed to be added to the code. Sustainability, not just sustainability of the environment, but also social and financial sustainability. We heard that we needed to address the independence of museums, independence from political influence, allowing museums to maintain their integrity in interpretation, in exhibitions, and in programming. We heard that equity, accessibility, and inclusivity needed to be emphasized more in the code, for they imply, among other things, equal rights and equal access to heritage for all. We heard also, largely actually from Latin American countries, that social responsibility and the social role of museums needed to be added to the code. Restitution and repatriation were issues that showed up all over the geographical map. as did fundraising and sponsorship, as fundraising becomes more important for many museums around the globe. And then finally, we heard that we needed to address the impact of new technologies on our workplaces, on our collections, and on our audiences. Next slide. The second consultation, which is still ongoing, asks again if we need to revise the Code of Ethics. And then it goes through the code principle by principle and asks, should each principle remain the same? If you answer no, how should the principle be removed or amended, and how and why? And then we also ask if there are missing concepts that need to be added, and if there are, which ones those are. Next slide. So far we have established a structure for the new code, and we've preliminarily revised the preamble. We've are currently conducting a thematic review of the existing principles, and we'll be working on this through the end of the year as we incorporate additional feedback from the second consultation that is still ongoing. Once we have conducted this review, we will map an outline of the proposed revision. We anticipate that there will be a lot that will be changed, that the principles, which now vary in length dramatically, will be of more equal weight, and that there may be several new principles added to the code. The third consultation, which will begin at next year, will review the outline, and people will have a chance to comment on the outline of the code and give us feedback on the items that we intend to include on the code. After we get the results of the third consultation, we'll draft the revised code and have a fourth consultation that will allow everyone to review the draft. Once that review is complete, we will update the revision, and then we'll go into the translation phase and eventually publish the revised code in the 3 official ICOM languages. While we would like to say that this process will end by the end of next year, it's most likely that we won't have a completely finished Code of Ethics translated into all 3 languages until the meetings in 2025. Next slide. So we're counting on all of your contributions. The comments that you make tonight will be very important to us, as well as comments that you can make in the consultation, in the survey for the consultation on the ICOM website. It's in member space under the FCOM page. Also, you can, if you find that you don't have enough space for your comments, or just want to write to us or send us other documents, you can send individual responses to ethics@icom.museum. So thank you very much for this webinar and for all of the comments that we hope will come. Thanks, Elko.
Thank you, Sally. That's great. Michele Rivet.
So, bonjour, bonsoir, good evening, good afternoon, wherever we are. Well, I just want to say first that thank you so much, Sally, for taking the time. I think it's a great endeavor, and I know that you're working very, very hard. You were yesterday morning with UK ICOM. You were, I think, last week with ICOM France, showing, of course, the importance that you give to that task. And I just want to say on my behalf and behalf of my colleagues that ICOM Canada will do its very best to be as helpful as possible. So please, the first slide. So, okay, to really focus on the Code of Ethics, it seems to me that we have to go back to what happened very recently, meaning the new museum definition. Reason is that, of course, the definition is linked with the Code of Ethics. And we've heard in several occasions when we were in Kyoto that the huge definition that was proposed well, encompassed many concepts that should have been in the Code of Ethics and not in the definition. If I may, I will read only the English version, but we have also the French. A museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Open to the public, accessible and inclusive, museum fosters diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experience for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge. Of course, we all recognize that that definition that was adopted by a majority of more than 92% of the people who voted on last 24th of August. Well, we all recognize, of course, that it is a compromise that took place, a compromise that was not for many of the, no, I shouldn't say many, for some of the national committees not going far enough. Some committees wanted to have decolonization, repatriation, and restitution. Some of committees thought it was not progressive enough, but nevertheless, this definition, well, it was a great success because it permitted to arrive to a definition that will be applied, that we will apply all over the world for ICOM. And as we know, and I'm going that immediately now in the Code of Ethics, but just a last sentence, as we all know, ICOM Canada played a major role in the definition, the new museum definition. And in April 2019, we had a proposal that was not really accepted. What happened in 2022 is not as important as we would like to have, but nevertheless, we were pleased and we really applaud that new definition. At least it's really, we're going forward. So what is, I think, of interest to know is how do we link the museum definition and the Code of Ethics? And I will just look, and maybe the second slide, please. And I will just look very briefly at some of the concepts that are mentioned within the museum definition, and how do we deal, what do we mean by these concepts? And I know that my colleague Sarah and Viviane may expand also on that, but nevertheless, I just want to say a few words on it. So what does it mean in the definition to have these new concepts? And I will refer to accessible and inclusive. And after that, I will say a few words on foster diversity and sustainability. And after that, of course, the third one that I will mention very briefly due to a lack of time, for the participation of the communities. So I want to refer first to the museum are accessible and inclusive. What do we mean by accessible and inclusive? Well, inclusion and accessibility, we all know, mean dismantling discrimination. Inclusion is bound up with human rights, inclusive society, inclusive museums, recognize and build development policies around the diversity of their members and enable everyone's full inclusion and participation, regardless of their status. So meaning that it's not, and we know traditionally that for accessibility, for disability, we have accommodation that is linked to it. No, it's much more. We must look, we must examine how our institutions, systems, practices, and spaces must themselves be transformed in order to make them available, accessible, meaningful, and rewarding for the too many diverse groups that make up our society. So it's really, it's a whole, comment dirais-je, it's a whole, by itself, just to have the museum accessible and inclusive, well, we need much more than what we have now, but it shows also that these concepts should be within the Code of Ethics. And Sally, you mentioned that in the first consultation that was said, because it's very important that the inclusivity, that the society, that the museum should be inclusive, should be accessible. If not, well, in a way, we're not fulfilling the definition that we're supposed to be part of. So the other slide, the next slide, please. Okay. So in the new definition, we read that museums foster diversity and sustainability. Les musées encouragent la diversité et la durabilité. Sustainability is a very large concept. An integral component of sustainability is the ability to embrace diverse communities and the unique voices they support, with increasing challenges related to climate change, resource scarcity, and population growth. And it is even more important now than ever that we work together to create a more resilient world. Sustainability, at its most basic, is concerned with the needs of the future. The general definition says that sustainability means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. When I was just looking to write these few sentences, I look at and I saw that in many countries, the concept of sustainability is really well developed, and really not only, as it was pointed out, I think, Sally, you mentioned it, not only in its environmental sense, but also in its social sense. And it's mostly developed in Brazil, like also in Australia. So museums have a role in building collaborative relationship and using education and research to raise awareness, to encourage the development of new skills and the ability to embrace and adapt to change. Museums must be aware of social issues such as equity and must work to be inclusive of all sectors in the community. Through their activities, collection, research, mediation, etc., all the specific missions of a museum. Through their activities, museums have an integral role in promoting and implementing sustainability in society. Museums have a far-reaching, deeply rooted connection with the communities. Museums should showcase for staff and the public their own efforts to work towards sustainability in all aspects of their work. So really, museums have a lot to consider. Museums have a lot to consider in all aspects of their missions, just to ensure that really they will be sustainable, meaning that they will build for the future and not only for the present, taking into account all these different components. Next slide, please. So, with the participation of communities, avec la participation des communautés, and I will end that in French. C'est extrêmement important ce passage-là de la nouvelle définition. La participation des communautés montre finalement comment le rôle du musée, le rôle des musées est complètement transformé, puisqu'on retrouve même ces concepts-là dans la définition. La participation des communautés, elle est à plusieurs niveaux et elle implique nécessairement que les musées doivent non seulement travailler en partenariat avec la société qu'ils desservent, mais en plus doivent impliquer les membres de ces sociétés-là, doivent les impliquer à différents niveaux, que ce soit au niveau de comités consultatifs, que ce soit même au niveau de prise de décision dans l'organisation de la vie même du musée. Je terminerai en disant tout simplement, et d'autres concepts se retrouvent dans la définition, mais le temps ne le permet pas, que je les aborde. Je dirais tout simplement que je pense qu'au Canada, on a fait des pas importants en commençant à comprendre, à réaliser l'importance des peuples premiers, en les amenant au musée et en les faisant jouer complètement leur rôle. Mais la participation des communautés dépasse en quelque sorte, et Dieu sait que je trouve extrêmement important la fonction que jouent les peuples premiers, que doivent jouer les peuples premiers dans nos musées. Mais tel que dit dans la nouvelle définition de musée, c'est encore beaucoup plus large. La participation des différentes communautés, la participation des différentes composantes de la communauté, que ce soit des composantes minoritaires parce qu'elles sont LGBT, parce qu'elles sont racisées, parce qu'elles sont discriminées pour une raison reliée à quelle qu'elle soit. Donc, c'est extrêmement important, non seulement d'aller vers les communautés, mais de les amener au musée, pour que finalement le musée représente véritablement ce que sont ces communautés, parce que les musées, somme toute, sont des fiduciaires au service des communautés qu'ils desservent. Je m'arrête là-dessus et I will be very pleased, of course, if time permits, to answer questions, but I will just end that for the time being. Thank you, Elka.
Merci, Michele. Sarah.
Thank you, merci. My question that I'm going to start with is why I even want to talk about the topic of what do archaeological ethics have to do with museum ethics in Canada. And just as I'm starting, I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Yellowknife's Dene, Chief Dry Geese territory here in Yellowknife Northwest Territories. I'm going to talk a lot on this first slide and then go through some other slides. So what is the connection between archaeology and museums in Canada? Almost backing up before that question, I'm really interested in ethics with respect to reconciliation and Indigenous people. So that's, as Michele was talking about at the end of her talk right now, how do we conceive of and think of the role of Indigenous people and Indigenous rights in museum ethics and in archaeological ethics? So that has been my academic background as well, and is part of my everyday life in the job I'm in here in the Northwest Territories. Canada has, for those who don't know, I thought I'd also talk about archaeology because I'm assuming that the audience here knows a little bit about the history of the Canadian Museum Association and the ethics there, but may not know much about the Canadian Archaeological Association. Something to note is, part of my academic background, I studied with some of the practitioners of what is called Indigenous archaeology, which was a way to sort of indigenize the practice and theory of archaeology, looking at archaeology from an Indigenous rights lens, and also making sure more Indigenous practitioners were part of that. Canada is arguably the home of Indigenous archaeology, which is something that has spread all over the world. So, as a nation, we do lead a lot of the conversations in terms of Indigenous rights to heritage and looking at those kind of issues. So heritage legislation is provincial or territorial matter, legislated at that level, but many jurisdictions, as you may know, have their major regional museums as the official repositories for all archaeological collections and objects that are found during excavation. So I know that's true of the Royal BC Museum, that's true of the Canadian Museum of History. My institution, the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre, is the final repository for all artifacts and material found in the Northwest Territories under the NWT Archaeological Sites Act. So when an academic comes to the NWT and does an excavation, all the objects are on loan to that academic from the government of the Northwest Territories, and the material does end up back here. So because of this, I would argue that archaeology is really intertwined with museums in many of our institutions. And in a lot of these cases, the authority isn't really in the hands of Indigenous people. The Canadian Archaeological Association is similar to the Canadian Museum Association, the professional association for archaeologists. Most archaeologists belong to it. And between 2018 and 2022, I sat on the ethics committee, which similar to what Sally was describing, you know, we had it was long overdue to update the ethics guidelines. And so we were tasked to both combine the old ethics guidelines about working with Aboriginal people into one code. It took us a while. It was kind of group editing, but the next few slides, I just wanted to go through some of the language that we ended up landing on just as a point of interest for what we might suggest to ICOM. I will also note, I'll talk very, very briefly about the Canadian Museum Association new statement of ethics with respect to Indigenous people. But again, I'm assuming that people might be familiar with that. And I will note that they released their document after we did this exercise with the archaeologists. So second slide, I guess, please, Flag. So what I've done is really edited down and only showing some of the bullet points that do relate to museums. So rather than read them all out loud, I just wanted to kind of look at some of the language that I've bolded. So, you know, the CAA wants to recognize Indigenous people's right, which is a very strong word, to maintain, control, protect their cultural heritage, using language of also free, prior, and informed consent about doing archaeological excavation. So, you know, it makes me think of what that might look like in a museum context. That archaeological evidence is a critical factor with legal recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights and title. What does that mean for museums holding this archaeological material? That Indigenous people have an inherent and unique relationship with their archaeological heritage. And you know, what are Indigenous approaches to protecting, conserving, and interpreting that heritage? Next slide. Under the heading collaborations and strengthening communities, word that jumped out to me was the idea of education, because I would argue that a lot of archaeological education occurs in a museum context. There are sometimes public archaeology programs, but what does that mean for museums to say that there's mutually beneficial partnerships on the education around archaeology and Indigenous heritage? The idea, we included a point about co-developing protocols for archaeological work. So I'm curious about, you know, is there a place for that in museums? And then also there's some language around the presentation of the past. And although the past is presented and interpreted within archaeological reports, I would also argue that a lot of that presentation also happens in museum contexts. Next slide. So under the heading of cultural places and traditional knowledges, you know, I think it was interesting that we landed on respecting not just provincial, territorial, federal standards and protocols and laws, but also Indigenous protocols about removal, curation, repatriation. You know, made sure that it was in the ethics to recognize Indigenous people's traditional knowledge. We talked a little bit about repatriation of archaeological collections, and to assist that was a duty of archaeologists to assist with those repatriation requests. Next slide. And then, you know, so those were the pieces that I took out of our ethics codes just to present and discuss. There is also a statement on the CAA website about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights for Indigenous People and the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action. And so these are, you know, to you know, make my bias and agenda clear, those are the documents I think that will help inspire me to think about what I'd like to advocate to ICOM to think about in their ethics. How does it guide Canadian archaeology and museology, and how do these documents guide what can we share with the rest of the world about how those guide and are starting to really become major factors in our discipline. So, you know, the CAA is making just so folks know, if they're not aware, that Canada did make United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People law in Canada last June 21st, 2021. And that does have implications for museums and how Canadian institutions and archaeologists manage Indigenous heritage. So objects and also managing and co-managing heritage in general. So again, this statement talks about free, prior, and informed consent. It talks about inviting Indigenous people to participate. And it also talks about amending policies and legislations so that Indigenous rights to control and protect their heritage are consistent with the principles of UNDRIP and the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Next slide. So as I said, the Canadian Museum Association just very recently released their document statement. It's quite long and fantastic, in my opinion, called Move to Action and how to activate the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in Canadian museums. These were the, okay, this is the second last slide, so right on. This is sort of their positioning statement on that document, really emphasizing that the Canadian Museum Association recognizes the role of museums as part of the colonial project and the need to use museums to help support Indigenous self-determination, which I think is quite a strong statement. Next slide. So yes, I just put the point in the current ICOM museum ethics, where I think we might want to expand, where I might argue to expand into looking at further issues of reconciliation and decolonization rather than just talking about communities. I think for countries like Canada that are settler colonial states, we might have to go a lot further in talking about how we might include some of those ideas in the ethics statement. And last slide, please. So thanks. I just wanted to put the all 11 official languages of the Northwest Territories. Thank you in all of the languages, and a couple of links for you. And I'm happy to continue the conversation if anybody ever wants to reach out. So great conversation. Thanks for hosting, Elka.
Thanks, Sarah. And Viviane.
Hello, bonsoir, everyone. Thank you so much, Elka and ICOM Canada, for inviting me to share my thoughts on the need to revisit ICOM's Code of Ethics. I was asked to focus my presentation on environmental sustainability, probably because of my involvement with the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And I am at the Museum of Vancouver, which is located at the site of the ancestral village of Senak. So it's always good to start with a definition. And what I like about this definition, it's simple and it reminds us that a code of ethics is there to help us conduct our work with honesty and integrity. In the context of climate emergency, the big question is, how can we perform our museum work with honesty and integrity without making climate adaptation mitigation central to our operation? The proposed principle, our role as climate educator must permeate everything we do, what we do, how we do it, and with whom. So based on that principle, the orientation needs to be to prioritize the role of museum as climate educator. So I have a few points here. What does that mean? Well, an alignment or realignment of museum mission, values, exhibition, everything we do in terms of public offer to support climate action across mandates, disciplines, collections. And I think it's very exciting because there are, for the museum, it means reinterpreting its role as as climate educator through the specificity of its collection, history, and network of experts. The second point is about communicating research on climate mitigation and adaptation to a wide audience, a diverse audience, the people that we already reach and the people that we should be reaching, and we know who these people are. It has to be information that's practical, engaging. So the third point is to, and it's a very central one really for me, is to address our collective nature deficit disorder. So to highlight the cost of human nature disconnectedness to the planet and to ourselves. And this is why it is necessary to foreground Indigenous worldviews, because Indigenous communities around the world have never forgotten their connection and responsibility to the land. They have always recognized the interdependence of all living things. We have so much, like Western museums, have so much to learn from these communities. The fourth point, museums need to leverage their power as cultural influencer to inspire changes and to inspire consumers to reduce their consumption and adopt a low carbon lifestyle and engage in circular model of consumption and production. My last point is, well, any good educators will model what they preach. So we need to systematically decarbonize our operations. Recent studies have shown that museums, generally speaking, are big polluters. And some recent studies have shown that some museums pollute even more than hospitals do. So this is shocking. And that means revisiting the way we generate exhibition, the way we build them, the way we travel them. We have to revisit, of course, the building envelope, the HVAC system, visitor amenities. The last point is, well, it's not a last point, but I wanted to end my presentation by talking about a practical application of some of the points I just discussed. So the Reclaim and Repair project at the Museum of Vancouver started when an organization that was aware of our work in eco-design practice contacted us and donated to us several tons of mahogany wood that originated from a marine industry, a local marine industry that was defunct. The museum decided to commission local designers, emerging and seasoned designers, to create objects made of this reclaimed mahogany. So the pictures you see here is when we delivered the mahogany to design schools and some of the design studio back in December of 2021. So in July 2023, the mahogany objects will be on display at the museum that will be built entirely of reused material. The mahogany objects will be for sale, and a significant portion of the proceeds will go to Indigenous-led reforestation efforts in Guatemala and Nicaragua, where the wood had been harvested in the 50s. the mahogany objects really become a backdrop, because what the important things is we want to introduce the principles and players involved in local circular economies. In this case, the players are several members of a deconstruction hub. We have municipal office, city planners, design stores, film industry, theater, several museums, and professional designers, schools invested in developing green sustainable curricula, and research centers in sustainability studies. So here's a project that aims to be low carbon, and we monitor our carbon footprint. It is a strong introduction to circular economy principle through demonstrations and program development. It is mobilizing designers from diverse backgrounds and engaging in reparative work. So clearly, the project is at the intersection of social and environmental justice. It is a multi-partner project that helps us build resilience in the community and create a cross-sectoral community of practice to adapt and mitigate climate change. So it's one example of many. There are many museums doing interesting work, and we need to know more about them. But so here are my initial thoughts. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Viviane. And I'm really sorry, Sarah, I know you have to go. Do you have to leave right this second? Or
I can stick around for a couple minutes, no problem.
Okay, 3 minutes. Anybody has any questions for Sarah? Please just go ahead. I think we can take 10 minutes or so for questions if anybody has any burning questions that they need to ask any of our participants. This webinar is being recorded, so I think that we will certainly circulate the link. We're going to put it up on our YouTube page, and we will send around information to all of the participants tonight. So just so you all know, and you can all send it to people you know. Okay, no questions at all? I know it's a lot to take in too.
Hello, can you hear me? Elizabeth Joy?
There we go. Yeah.
Hi. Very interesting. I know we're lack of time, so I'm just going to jump in. And I was actually on a consultation for conservators about with regards to our practice with Indigenous communities, and also one on the museum policy, the new museum policy. So there's a lot of work being done right now. There's also so I'm really interested in reading. Began as an archaeology conservator, so I'm really interested in reading the new the CAA policy. There's also been work by so somebody mentioned the Canadian Museums Association, but there's also the Canadian Archival Archivists Association that have a new policy as well. I think sustainability with regards to preservation, I've seen a lot of waste in museum in my 40 years of career in museums, especially with exhibitions. I have a international and national exhibition experience. So very interested in what Viviane has talked about. I work with Indigenous communities. The sustainability, the accessibility. I have one question, and it's very delicate, and Viviane, I'm not, it's not a criticism or anything. It's just one thing that went ding in my head. You know, and about the delicacy of when we're developing policies and how we're thinking about it. Like the Mahogany exhibition, for example, about returning money to Nicaragua, where right now there's huge human rights violations. So again, it's just to be really coherent in everything that we're doing, and how this policy that and that incredible challenge, how our museum policy is going to really able to guide us and help us work ethically around the world. So, but thank you.
Point well taken. I'll just go back to saying that we're working with the Sustainability Hub and Research Center at UBC to make sure that we're like narrowing down the Indigenous-led groups that are involved in reforestation efforts. So I hear you. It's very important to know who we work with.
Yeah, but it shows how important we need these guidelines, these ethics to help us work ethically around the world and with Indigenous groups. I mean, when I started in the in Heritage in the late 70s, we did not work the right way with Indigenous communities or with communities. There was a lot of we know best kind of, which we've got to change. Yeah. All right, so thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Anybody else want to weigh in or make a comment or question as a question? Doesn't look like it. Okay. Well, I hope, thank you very much to all of the participants. I was fascinated personally. And as I said, this is going to go up on our YouTube page. So we'll send the link to everyone. Please send it to whoever you like. And please ask everyone to participate in the Code of Ethics questionnaire. And we are going to do some consultation over the next week or so with all of the ICOM members. So we will be sending out the original survey. I think the second iteration of the survey to everybody, just as a reminder. Sally, I guess we'll just put the ethics committee email on that, email address on that, so that if anybody has any comments, they can make those.
Yes. And that anybody, as I said earlier, anybody can send a comment to ethics@icom.museum.
Right. Okay. And Victoria has a point. She says the public already believes that museums have ethical practice, and they're surprised when that is revealed to be false, damages museums as institutions of public value. Well, we all have to kind of bite the bullet on that one, I think.
We all have our work cut out for us, I think.
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
we do. Thank you all for coming, and have a lovely evening. And I hope to hear from all of you about this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.